My name is Bobby Kia. It's a pleasure to have all of you here. We're going to welcome right now the President and CEO of OPIC, who is graciously hosting us. And please provide a round of applause for her.
Thank you very much. I really hate having this table between us. It's a strange room, so I'm going to come around here at the risk of stressing out the front row and sit on the corner of the table. Well, thank you all for coming. It's a real delight to be able to host all of you, and I am delighted at the idea that we're doing this joint venture for this inclusive seminar between GW Business School and OPIC. I really want to thank Bobby Kia for organizing it, and I know many of you at GW have been very involved in organizing this too, so I want to thank you as well. I understand that this day is supposed to be a sort of an inclusive dialogue about what we can do to encourage more private sector engagement in directing capital and energy and expertise to solving unmet social needs, to solving development challenges. And certainly that's something that's at the very heart of what I've been working on for most of my career, whether it be at JP Morgan or at the World Bank or at CGAP in microfinance, and certainly now here. So I applaud deeply this objective, and it resonates very much with me in every regard. I understand the day is going to be organized around 3 levels of analysis. First at the individual level and the individual investment in this area of channeling private sector capital to meet development needs, then the firm level, and then a partnership level. And I think that's exactly the right way of going around it. And I gather you're going to then look at the mechanisms through which private capital can be engaged and channeled to these ends. I thought before we started, though, and maybe as a way of giving a little background, I might just sort of step back and give you some just thoughts on development, how it's working, and how the private sector has become involved over the last 10 or 15 years, if I may. So in stepping back for a second, I was going to mention 3 things that most people don't know about development, and then close with 3 policies, 3 things I think we need to do to make sure that the private sector is engaging as fully as it can. So the 3 things I'd like to cite that most people don't know about development, most of you probably do, but they're first, we're actually winning. More than 500 million people have been lifted out of extreme poverty in the last couple of decades. Economic growth in developing countries is almost double what it is overall in developed countries. So we're winning, first. Secondly, it's not what you think. Most Americans think the US government spends 25% of its GDP on foreign aid. Most Americans think that. And of course, as we all know, it's 1%. So that campaign when people had just 1% on a button walking around in their lapels is a very powerful thing. And frankly, if we could do nothing else but spread the word that it's only 1% of our budget, I think we would do a lot to advance the cause of foreign aid and development. And third, and more relevant to what we're addressing here today, is more and more the tab is being split. 40 years ago, when OPIC was created, 70% of the flows from the US to emerging markets were in the form of overseas development assistance. Now, 40 years later, over 80% of the flows from the US to developing countries is actually FDI. So it used to be heavily dominated, our flows outward used to be heavily, to emerging markets, used to be heavily dominated by aid, and now they're heavily dominated by FDI. That's very important. And certainly it's part of the reason why you're all gathering here today. So I guess the question is, how can this conversation and the conversations we're having all around the world today about engaging the private sector in solving development problems build on the fact that the FDI is now flowing to emerging markets? How do we engage and encourage the private sector to engage? How do we recognize that, for example, rebuilding an economy in Afghanistan cannot be done with aid money alone? It's got to be done with the private sector. If we're going to meet the challenges of climate change, if we're even going to meet the $100 billion the developed world has committed to financing climate change in emerging markets every single year from 2020 on, $100 billion a year, how are we going to do that without engaging the private sector? You know, the rich countries spend $158, I think, billion a year in 80,000 projects, foreign aid. $158 billion a year in 80,000 projects. That's way too diffuse to ever be channeled in ways that's going to solve some of these really, really big problems. We've seen over the last sort of 10 years, though, a really exciting evolution, not just in terms of development agencies such as OPIC trying to pull in the private sector, but real mainstream businesses like the PepsiCos, like even Walmart, whatever you think, Coca-Cola and other companies actually shifting from understanding, from this thing, the idea of development being very arm's length to it being more integrated into their strategies. So 5, 6, 7 years ago, at the beginning, it was the companies were taking these sort of Hippocratic oaths and saying and signing on to do no harm policies, like the Equator Principles, policies that would protect the environment, policies that respected labor and human rights. But these were all not about doing good, but about making sure that they weren't damaging anything. And they embraced them, and I think the Equator Principles was a very important dimension of that, and many other similar sets of standards have followed. That emerged from that do no harm Hippocratic oath era into then more and more companies started doing things actively with communities where they worked. But this was still done out of their community service or out of their foundation arm. So do no harm then to giving money, but really separate from the business itself. It's over here, it's making nice with the communities. And only in the last few years have we actually seen companies realizing that it's only when they integrate these principles into their very business models, into working with the supply chain, into supporting their supply chain, make better product, live better livelihoods, earn more income, for example, that these principles become really genuinely embedded in the business, in the business, that business's sort of psyche, and it's profitable for everybody. So that's been the evolution we've seen. It's an incredibly important and exciting time to capitalize on it and recognizing that business can be a force for good. Now, this is where we sort of cue into impact investing, which I know I think John Simon will be leading a panel on later on, and so I won't touch on it there. But I think the notion that business can be a force for good is becoming very, very powerful. Now, is every business everywhere always going to be focusing on being green, being organic, and taking care of its supply chain? No. In a way, this is really not going to be the principal concern of the new middle class in India and Africa and elsewhere. Of course it's not. But still, people dismiss the impact investing world or the corporate sustainability world or those businesses that are focusing on solving development problems as being minor and irrelevant compared to the mainstream business. But we're not comparing it to mainstream business, and we're not comparing it to mainstream $1 trillion of financial markets. We're comparing it to what's being done in development. We're just trying to take a small proportion of that money that's invested in capital markets, a small proportion of those businesses that can do the right thing, and shift their energies towards development, and that will make a huge impact compared to the amount of money and energy being spent on pure development today. So, as I mentioned, $158 billion being spent every year on foreign aid, 80,000 projects. Imagine that, you know, just a few of the top Fortune 500 companies in the U.S. and elsewhere in Europe spending a little bit more of their energy on their supply chain, that could massively overshadow the amount of money being spent in foreign aid. So just mentioning a couple of things, I think we need to do in terms of to make this happen. I'd say 3 things. One is clearly policies. We need to make sure that we're finding ways that governments and others can put in place the right kind of policies in their countries that attract and reassure private investment, creating the right enabling environment, building the right business climate, ensuring that there's a judiciary that's fair, that taxes are predictable and just. So the policy environment, I think we all know about. The IFC's Doing Business report has been a big contribution to that. Secondly, partnerships, which is, again, a big topic for today. Figuring out the right way to build those partnerships, to design the incentives to make partners come together, making sure that egos and turf are taken care of, making sure that deep mutual suspicions, visceral suspicions of the business sector and the philanthropic sector for one another are addressed in those partnerships. And then third, instruments. And for that, I mean aligning different types of capital that are relevant to solve different kind of problems. Grant money to cover early operating losses. Technical assistance money to build the kind of implementing organizations that need to do some of this work. Equity that covers the base of the capital structure in any project. And then, of course, debt. So aligning those instruments is very important. So I'd say those three things: policies, partnerships, and then instruments in terms of what needs to be put in place to ensure that the private sector is doing as much as it can to shoulder the development burden. And of course, the last one I would mention, I can't not mention it, is policies that strengthen organizations such as OPIC, whose very job it is to do this work. And so I guess that's a nice segue into what is it we do. I hope some of you know a little bit about OPIC. And I'll just close by mentioning a few things. Our OPIC is the US government's development finance institution. Most G8 countries have one, KFW and FMO and BIO in Belgium, and frankly, then there's the multilaterals like the IFC. We're a very similar entity to all of those. Our mission in life is to channel private sector capital to help solve development challenges in emerging markets. We do that by designing financing and risk mitigation tools like political risk insurance that are specifically designed to stimulate capital investment and to remove the barriers that hold that investment back, like risk. We focus on investing in the most highly developmental countries and in the sectors that are the most valuable for those countries. Everything from microfinance to health, to water, to renewable energy, to infrastructure, to telecommunications, etc. We operate sort of roughly equally between the major regions of the world. We're open in about 100 countries. We have, as I mentioned, we can do debt, we can support private equity funds, and we can create very creative debt risk mitigating instruments like political risk insurance. We don't have an equity instrument, and we don't have a grant instrument, which means that we work oftentimes in partnership with agencies like USAID and others that have those instruments that can come along with us and provide the series of types of financial instruments that are required to actually solve some of these development challenges. So that's roughly by way of introduction. 3 things you don't know about development, 3 challenges to address, and a few things about OPIC as well to start you off for your day. So with that, I welcome you, and I'm not sure who I'm handing over the mic to now. It's going to Shorty. Okay. Sorry, I didn't look at the schedule. Thank you very much. Thank you.
It's a pleasure to be here today. I'm going to talk about starting the history and drivers of market-based solutions to development challenges. This stems from my work over about 15 years with the enterprise funds. Indeed, I need to get you.
It's here on the.
On there, ready?
Yep.
Indeed, private sector approaches embodied in the enterprise fund model run through multinational strategic social investing and public-private partnerships. There's been an evolving recognition of the private sector role in the development over the years, as Elizabeth mentioned. In the mid-'80s, there were inquiries into what USAID was doing to focus on the private sector. And out of that came a sector assistance reporting system. I don't know if it's still being used. I dealt with it in the 80s. Then with the collapse of the Soviet regimes in the Central and Eastern Europe, someone in Congress and the Bush administration had the idea of creating enterprise funds to help facilitate the development of the private sector in Poland and Hungary initially. Later, as private investors took an increased interest in emerging markets, again, as Elizabeth mentioned, that shift from capital flows going to development to capital flows going to the private sector The Global Development Alliance was established to capitalize on the on PPP models. Interestingly, the person who helped develop the enterprise fund model at AID, Don Presley, 20 years later, also helped conceive the Global Development Alliance when he was acting administrator of AID. Over time, multinational corporation approaches to CSR shifted from the focus on the short-term, ad hoc, community development type programs, again, as Elizabeth mentioned, to more strategic and sustainable. Actually, Don hired me to come to Booz Allen to help develop a program along those lines based on what had been going on at the enterprise funds over the last 15 years at that time. Small businesses are definitely the engines of growth, but how do you deploy the assistance effectively to help grow them and impact economic growth? In 1989, as I mentioned, policymakers and investors were faced with daunting challenges in Central Eastern Europe. There was an unprecedented change from a command economy to free markets. No roadmaps, unknown risk. Weak ecosystems. Systemic change takes time. So how are you going to get something done quickly? Capital professionally deployed was recognized, as I mentioned, by Congress and Bush administration as the fuel for business growth, and that you needed to give the public a broader stake in the economy by providing them with entrepreneurial capital, and this demonstrated the prospects for the future. We had to move very quickly with the enterprise funds at that time, so that was one of the reasons the enterprise funds were created, to bypass impediments created by red tape and normal government programs. Response were, as mentioned, the enterprise funds, Poland 240 million, 60 for Hungary. They were conceived, very simple mission, to promote development of the private sectors and policies and practices conducive to private sector development. We didn't have a lot of metrics. Those were the basic drivers. If we succeeded, it was obvious. So some of the background: capitalized with public funds, managed privately and independently. We had an independent board appointed by the president to achieve a dualistic mission, primarily development, but on commercial terms, using commercial private sector disciplines and drivers. Focus was at the microeconomic level, and from that we had macroeconomic effects, because when we built the underpinnings for the market, the institutions followed, rather than doing it from a top-down approach that didn't fit the needs of the market. We had to act quickly, place capital in the hands of entrepreneurs. We did it, and we also deployed technical assistance. We attracted, on top of that, private capital to leverage the impact of those public funds. Sustainable commercial investment is not a project. So the enterprise funds were created to last for a long time. And eventually they went out of existence, but they were substituted by private funds run by the former management. So projects run out of money. This kind of model is more like a business model where it has perpetual life. Some of the achievements in Poland after 10 years with a $240 million capital base, $200 million we invested in direct equity, we participated in IPOs, $300 million in a small loan program that then we spun out into a bank and sold it to Fortis. At that point, there were $180 million in loans to 30,000 micro-enterprises. By the time they closed that program, the Fundusz Mikro had made 156,000 loans to about 130 small enterprises. By 2001, Enterprise Fund completed its mission, returned $120 million. The way it was designed was to return only half the money to the U.S. Treasury. Another $120 million was created in a foundation, Polish American Freedom Foundation, that now has about $250 million in it. The privatized management team, as I mentioned, for these enterprise funds, raised another $2 billion in private institutional capital and continued to invest, and they attracted other investors to the region. There were others in Poland, Hungary. Ensuing years, they created them in other countries. The strategies for each are really dictated by the local needs and conditions. You have to focus on that. The enterprise fund in Bulgaria started off slowly with $55 million. It returned its capital and left behind a legacy foundation with $400 million in it. Similar funds were created by others then. So overall, with $1.2 billion in U.S. grant funding, the enterprise fund's been at work. creating businesses, building capacity, doing development, creating infrastructure, and yet capital base remains intact. It's even larger than that original capital. So some of the fundamentals are that people who have an equity stake in society become middle class. Private sector approaches produce quicker and better results. Private sector creates jobs that are sustainable. Government helps create the conditions for private sector to create those kind of jobs. Providing a direct opportunity for a lot of little people oftentimes has a bigger impact than grandiose schemes. I saw that at the Economic Summit in Casablanca in 1994. There was talk about an Arab-Israeli development bank. That never happened because it was just too big of something that was trying to be put together. And if they had been putting money into the hands of a broad spectrum of people, they might have had a better impact. Taking action and adjusting is more effective than trying to create the perfect system. And addressing, as I mentioned it earlier, the bottom-up approach to building firms that then build the ecosystem is more effective. So what are some of the drivers? You need to have a critical mass of capital. You can't do this unless you have substantial financial support for what you want to achieve. You have to have long-term committed professionals. One of my colleagues has been working in Poland 21 years later. He's executive VP for the enterprise investors, is the follow-on fund fund manager for the enterprise fund, and they now have $2 billion under management, but he's been there for 21 years. Private sector decision-making and risk-taking approaches can provide much speedier and longer-term results. Independent boards from the private sectors with government oversight. I was working with the chief advisor, a former chief advisor to science advisor to Israel, and a couple weeks ago he was making this very point about independent boards. And then this week, I was with out in Silicon Valley at Stanford giving a talk on innovation financing with one of the creators of Silicon Valley, and he also was making the same point. Government has a role, but having independent boards free of government to make decisions is critical. Substantial leverage is achieved through private sector vehicles capitalized by public funds, though, and executing that mission and to execute missions and demonstrate commercial opportunities. At the same time, on another flip side of that, investment in doing business in transitional economies is not purely a commercial play. Socioeconomic development activities are often crucial to viability. This is what Elizabeth was talking about in terms of the corporate initiatives that were primarily focused on community development, and now they recognize that in order for them to be effective, you got to have that give and take with what they're trying to achieve on a business model as well. Catalysts at the micro level, as I mentioned, help create the workable policy framework. Focusing on a business-to-business perspective in relationships. Quid pro quo. I give you something, I want something back. I see a lot of grant programs. Grant programs are catalytic, they can do good work, but when you're dealing to try to build businesses, you've got to have them committed. You've got to have them understanding that they have to do something back. Support for viable local private sector serves the needs of the larger public and is crucial to not only development, but to the stability of society. And then, of course, capital that's not dissipated in expenditures, but is invested remains as an asset. Systemic change takes time, tangible action drives change. You just can't wait for the perfect system to be developed. So private sector approaches can overcome development challenges, identifying the building blocks in this particular economy, moving quickly to demonstrate opportunities, showing that help and change is on the way, particularly in these early stages of a transition in a reconstruction of an economy post-conflict or post-disaster like Haiti. Providing foundation for basic human needs, that is creating opportunity to the grassroots. When you do that, you not only build the economy, but you also play on that economy. With a small start, you can bring broad impact sustained by profit-driven motives, because that's the great arbiter of the value of something to society. And also, you mobilize others then. Taking risk, instilling hope in the future is critical. So, I think that's it? Yep, that's it. Any questions or comments? We'll talk to you later, or we only have short times, but I'll be around. Thank you. Do we have a time for question, or we, well, the other? One, yes.
Yeah, but when you talked about microfinancing, sometimes people see it kind of like a credit card because you have to identify what type of entrepreneurships, what type of people to invest in. So sometimes there's a thing called survive entrepreneurship, which is some guy opens up a tea shop just to survive and provide for his family. He really doesn't have any kind of interest in taking that money and throwing it into business and pulling the rest of his community people. So how do you identify the right type of people or businesses to grow to give that microfinancing?
Well, a lot of that you have to be there on the ground.
Okay.
So if you're on the ground, you can do it a lot more easily than from afar, if I'm understanding the kind of program you're talking about correctly. One of the most important things that comes with money is the mentoring. And that's why professionals bring mentoring. They help build the companies. And they have the presence there, as you'll hear from Mildred a little bit later on small enterprise assistance funds. They bring those other skills. And so it's not just a matter of money, it's what comes with the money. So that makes a big difference.
Thank you.
Okay. You got one more? You want to, others want to start coming up? Yes?
When you talk about sustainability, are you speaking solely about the capacity essentially for self-sustaining economic development, or is there the other definition of sustainability involved as well in terms of long-term life cycle costs of particular types of businesses, internalizing, formerly externalized costs to the business, everything from toxicity to, climate change?
Well, I look at it more, if you have viable businesses, first thing you have to have is a business. Somebody has to be producing something. Then you can introduce those other things you need to do in a society. If people are starving, they need to pick up a gun to go and get paid for doing something illegal. You have a destructive society. So first thing, let's fix the problem and then fix the next things in any given society. Sometimes you can do more at one time together, but first things first. Thank you.
Thank you all for attending. Can you hear? Is this capturing?
Yeah, that's good.
Oh, great. So I don't have to be talking normal conversational tones. First off, I'd like to thank Bobby for organizing this. It's really a tremendous group he's pulled together, both in terms of the folks on this side of the table and looking out. I think the folks on that side of the table too. So it's nice to see you all, and I hope we'll have a great discussion on impact investment as one of the private sector development tools that are out there. I'm very privileged to be on a panel with so many distinguished folks in the area of what is now being called impact investment. To my immediate right is Mildred Collier. We share the experience of having both been executive vice presidents of OPIC, although Mildred was also the CEO for a period of time. And she now is the COO of SEAF, the Small Enterprise Assistance Fund, which probably has, 20 years history investing in a large part of what is called impact investing. To her right is Mitchell Strauss. Mitchell is the heart and soul of what is called impact investing here at OPIC. She has really driven a large part of the efforts to create what I think of when we started was called the socially responsible investment practice, but now has taken on this new name. If you look back over the last few years, from the most recent impact investment call to the Africa Social Development Fund call to a whole lot of other things that were done in between, you'll see Mitchell's fingerprints on a large part of that. And Ewan Marshall's with the IFC. He has been there for, is it over a decade?
Almost a decade.
Almost a decade. And as you all know, IFCs sort of are much, much larger, and in this room, I shouldn't say are, but in this room I will, much, much larger, bigger brother across town, the World Bank's private investment group, which has done an incredible amount of investment in the promoting private sector development across the world and across the developing world. Given the experience of SEAF and OPIC and the IFC, it's clear that private sector investing as a tool for development has been something that's been around for quite some time. But the real point of this panel and the real discussion is what's changed in recent years. And the thing that has changed that I referred to in the various introductions has really been this concept of impact investment. And impact investment as a potential development tool is something that can really enhance the developmental mission of each of these organizations and of a larger and growing community of impact investors around the globe. And really, I'd like to start it off with Mildred, and just, given, you've been in the development finance world, you're in sort of an impact investment fund of sorts, although it wasn't called that when you started.
Right.
What do you see as being new and different about the rise of this concept of impact investment, and how does it make what you do easier, and how does it potentially make it a little bit harder?
Great question, and I think as was said earlier, the long history with the enterprise funds, the long history at OPIC, at IFC, and organizations like CEEP. This is a type of activity harnessing the private sector to do things that have beneficial long-term effects for the growth and development of economies. And it's been around for a while, and I think the thing that really has changed, and we've learned a lot of lessons, I think, from the microfinance sector, just in terms of how you have to give some shape and visibility, and you have to name something in order for people to really coalesce around it. And so, we were doing SME investing all these years, and Mitchell had an SME program, but then got put into a greater finance department, and then spun out again to focus on SMEs. And so, there have been these trends that have gone back and forth, but at the end of the day, the kind of work that she's doing, that IFC is doing, has been happening for a while. But what's different now, I think, is the lens through which we're looking at it, and the fact that there are more partners now who are seriously engaged in this as an activity that has the beneficial effects that we were all created to achieve, but to really do it with the lens of sustainability, from the standpoint of recognizing that you've got to have enough financial return so that these things can continue over time. And whether it's the successive fund models that the enterprise funds have demonstrated can succeed, where the financing vehicle itself takes on a second generation and a third generation, and also has the positive spin-off of creating a foundation to do the things that require more grant type support, that's a very holistic approach. And I think the fact that as was also Francis also said, we're not talking about projects anymore. We're talking about investments, and we're seeing that the investments have multiple sides. So I think for me, what's changed is giving a new name to this sector. Whether it hasn't really created a new asset class, I'm not completely convinced, but it certainly has put a whole new focus of attention and brought together a group of players, some of whom previously existed, but that are enticing new players to come into the room. And I think what it says for those of us who've been here for a while is that we have to continue to push the edge of the envelope, because the kind of garden variety safe things that we had been doing in the past, we've got to push ourselves to get out there a little bit further. We've got to go to places like Afghanistan and try something that is a little higher risk, because we know that the reward potential is very great from doing it in other markets that didn't have all those risks. And what Mitchell and IFC are doing, what OPIC is doing with its leadership, what IFC's done with its SME Ventures program and other impact investing things are helping make mainstream, I think, some of the things that looked cutting edge 20 years ago. Now they're not as cutting edge. We're bringing more people along that path. So I think that's having a lot of new partners is good.
As a quick follow-up, you mentioned Afghanistan. Is there an example, maybe Afghanistan is one, of something that you would sort of say epitomizes impact investing, and maybe in the form that it's now become to be sort of more popularly known?
Well, I mean, it's a good example, but it's also an example of where we had a lot of good pieces of the puzzle that we could bring to bear, but not all of them. And I think it's it's taking some time to get the rest of the pieces to the puzzle. And Elizabeth mentioned this too. I think OPIC, just by the nature of its statutory creation, had some tools, but not all the tools. And so when we went into Afghanistan with OPIC support and have been making loans to SMEs there, ideally that was an environment that needed an equity component as well, but it was not a tool that OPIC had at its disposal. And so we've been using the debt as flexibly as possible, and OPIC has been very accommodating in that respect. But the other thing that was missing was there was no technical assistance capacity that OPIC could bring to the table as our primary partner. And it took a couple of years of demonstration of success before then we were able to get AID to come along and now provide some technical assistance in the form of grants. So ideally, you bring all those pieces to the table together. You don't, have to spread it out for as long a period of time. And I think, the enterprise fund model is one that often is overlooked as in this space and not given, I think, enough credit for what it has achieved. But what happened there was that it was hugely efficient. All the necessary tools were brought to the table at the same time, and they got going. What's happening now, I know Mitchell can speak more about this, and I'm sure IFC as well, that a lot of inefficiency is in this impact space right now because all the tools aren't together in the same place at the same time, and a lot of the participants in this space spend a fair amount of their time trying to bring all those pieces together. So, looking back periodically at successes like what the enterprise funds have achieved is not a bad thing.
Mitchell, from your perspective, is there something new here? I mean, as Elizabeth pointed out, OPIC's been in business for now almost 40 years. It's been trying to promote development through investment for a long, long time. Has engaged in many projects that look a lot like what are now in the impact investment criteria. Is there something new here? And what would you view as some of the characteristics of what makes an impact investment different than the other type of investments that have been done for a long, long time in many of these markets?
Thank you, John. Welcome, everybody, especially these great panelists and guests. I think one of the things that's new is that we're all sitting here right now. There's students and professionals and people are talking about something called impact investing, which I had the great fortune because John was not able to attend a meeting, and there was an agenda, and the agenda topic was how can we all collectively invest to achieve more impact. I mean, it's really as simple as that. And it was Anthony Bug-Levine at Rockefeller that convened a group of people in probably one of the best field trips I ever took in Bellagio, Italy. People laughed at me. And we talked about how investors, many of whom were European, could work on things like collaborative agribusiness projects in Africa. And that was new. I mean, giving those words to what it was we did collectively was new. And one of the things that is part of what I do in attempting to achieve projects that have both a financial return and a positive social and environmental return is bring together parties with their capital or their grant money, and most importantly, with their willingness as individuals to see great, good things happen in the world. And, we talk about collaboration. It's just, I don't know how many syllables word. It's incredibly difficult to do. I sit here with one from the IFC. We don't do as many projects with the IFC as we would like to do. I'm right now working on a pretty big microfinance transaction that was put in place just after the financial crisis to make available capital to global microfinance entities, and the IFC is leading it. And it's a collaboration of a number of international financial institutions. And OPIC is a little harder to deal with. We always have to have a U.S. entity from the private sector participating. So as an example, CEIF is a U.S. not-for-profit. If they participate, we're halfway there. But that facility took so long to put into place that we had to rename it the microfinance, not emergency relief facility, but rather the expansion facility. And just now we're starting to see increased need coming out of the industry of microfinance to expand. Things slowed down a great deal. But these collaborative efforts with all of our lawyers and all of our policy requirements and all of our little niches are incredibly difficult to achieve. So what we've seen recently, and much through the great auspices of entities such as the Rockefeller Foundation, is the standing up of sort of like associations, groups of people, the Global Impact Investing Network, which has spawned itself a rating system. We talked when we were in Italy about how do you create investments for huge investors, hedge fund investors, corporates, and high net worth individuals. And one of my personal favorites is regular people. You know, what does it take? What do you have to do to make them look mainstream? Well, you know, if before Moody's and S&P all kind of got like, well, maybe they're not that smart after all. But you give them these attributes and you make them look normal. So there's the thing called the Global Impact Investment Rating System. So they're ratings. There's a standard nomenclature called IRIS to try and make things look normal. So that when an investor sees a beekeeping operation, and oh, by the by, you know, you want to talk about climate change, you lose the bees, you're in trouble. You know, bees are really necessary for food security and life. But how do you compare a $100,000 investment in a beekeeping endeavor? You know, you make some honey, but meanwhile back at the ranch the bees are flying around, to a renewable energy project, you know, wind project. It's $100,000 and you're cognizant that they're rich people or they're, you know, they're actors or actresses. They're regular people, or maybe they're corporate guys. But they're second guessing themselves all the time. At one point, in one part of them in their heart knows they're supposed to help people, but this other part of them doesn't want to look like a schlump. So rating systems are really important. And then we have industry groups like the Aspen Network of Development Entrepreneurs. And John missed another meeting. That was in Aspen, Colorado. They were two really, you know, sort of
I think I was in Abuja.
important meetings for the formation of what is now a collective endeavor. And I think the most extraordinary part about it is, and then I'll stop. There was a map that I just saw, and it had all the projects that the World Bank has done on a map, and it had all the projects USAID had done on the same map. And it was a map of Malawi, and it was segmented by whatever Malawi has states, and you could see the income levels of these various sectors. And that was the first time, to my knowledge and to the knowledge of all these super mappers, that USAID's projects were on the same map as the World Bank. And oh, by the way, that's the only map, because so far USAID is still in the process of getting its projects on a map. And imagine if everybody that's in the world of development could put not only what they've done, which is extraordinarily important and we can pat ourselves on the back, but imagine if we could put the pipeline projects on and build these collaborations much faster. So
It
that's
seems
what
that
I'm
an emerging
seeing that's
theme for both Mildred and you, Mitchell, is that collaboration is a key component of this new era. Are there any other elements you would view as sort of defining characteristics of this type of investment that differentiates it, like I say, perhaps from the type of thing that OPIC would have been doing 20 years ago?
20 years ago, OPIC responded, I think, to what came over the transom. Generally, we were driven by the desires of U.S. private capital and investors to go abroad and seek new markets. And in the beginning, they came with their bankers. Now, over the course of the last few administrations at OPIC, we increasingly put transactions together to respond to need, whether it be need of the administration for a certain region or sector, or whether it be a crying human need like climate change and renewable energy. One of the most amazing things is, I think we're trying to be a thought leader. We're trying to do, symposiums such as this. We actually trained everybody in OPIC about what is impact investment. And is it different than anything else we do? No, because everything we do is a positive financial return, social return, environmental return. but does there exist a spectrum on which at one end you have a power plant and everybody needs power, and on the other end you've got a nut processor, cashews in Mozambique, where former, well, they're still orphans, but they're older, will work in a plant processing cashews, which value adds for the country, and if and when the profits occur, 30% of those profits will go to support orphanages. Now that's like a multi-spectrum kind of super impact project, and that's the kind of thing that we want to support, either hopefully not so many one-off, but to build vehicles, financing vehicles that can accept these opportunities and raise them up with grant money and finance.
And I was just going to say, I mean, I think, you know, Mitchell's point is an excellent one. I think, you know, what OPIC has done is it's willing to be first, and I think IFC is playing this role as well, and it's willing to be persistent. And those two things together, sort of come early and come often, it's really important, because these things don't happen the first time. You know, the idea is crazy the first time. The second time it's a little less crazy. The third time, you know, they're actually looking you straight in the eye. And the fourth time, they might actually, you know, be ready to come along. So I think it takes that persistence to build a field like this, and to name it and get participants who are willing to really, you know, take it to the next level, take it out to the edge, but also take it to a point where there's some potential for scale. And that means, you know, some bright, shiny, new things, but also some things that aren't bright, shiny, and new, but now are a little bit tested and are ready for the next stage.
I think this is a great segue to you, Yoon, because the IFC is at a scale that's significantly larger than all the other development finance institutions. And it does have products like the AV loans that seek to reach out to commercial pools of capital, so some of the big types of capital that Mitchell was referring to, the hedge fund managers, some of the larger scale banks, as well as the sovereign wealth funds, for instance, through the asset management business. How does the IFC view itself as being able to connect this type of investment to those pools of capital and reach the scale that Mitchell was talking about?
Yeah, so I was kind of reflecting as my colleagues were speaking around impact investing and what does it mean for IFC, and I wholeheartedly agree that what has happened is that we have this space, this terminology that enables collaboration. I think for IFC it creates a crisis of identity and confidence.
Mm-hmm. For everyone, I think.
And for two reasons, one of which is where I struggle, and I think where IFC struggles, and I'm not sure whether everyone struggles, we talk about it, impact investing, it is going to do. What is it? What are we really talking about here? Is this a label? Is it a catch-all? Or is there something in impact investing that gives it definition, that gives it form? To me, one of the sort of the best kind of frameworks that I saw was, I think the Monitor Institute provided this kind of, and it goes to the notion of the spectrum, of the distinction between investments that are being made to create some form of social or environmental benefit, and they call these impact first, so there's a primary kind of focus, and then finance first, where we're trying to make a capital return, and by the way, there are social and environmental benefits. IFC as an investor has traditionally, and I think still, positioned itself very much in the finance first space. And the rationale for that is very similar to the enterprise funds, is how can we make the private sector the engine for driving growth, for addressing environmental externalities in a way that makes business sense and makes good returns for investors. Perhaps what we do is we view risk differently. And obviously if your sort of test of commerciality is a risk-return equation, if you see risk differently, you might take returns that others wouldn't be prepared to take. So we will do, you know, and this is the luxury, I think, of a public sector cost base. You know, we have 80 people who do social and environmental risk assessment on every single investment that IFC makes. Credit Suisse as a group, which I'm not sure how many multiples of IFC Credit Suisse is, have 6. It's the nature of the ability to invest in our cost. Of course, my response to that would be, well, IFC is a AAA rated institution. Our return on equity over the last sort of 10, 15 years runs at 23, 24%, which outstrips any top quartile private equity benchmark. So perhaps investing in 80 people have helped us make better investments. I don't know. It might also be that, you know, in our case, we're the little sister of the World Bank Group, and you know, maybe we get access in areas that others don't. Or maybe we just understand the risk of the countries in which we're operating, which enables us to price our intervention a little better. So from an impact perspective, IFC's always been in that kind of let's make good investments. One thing that I think has changed is we are now more and more starting to try and capture in quantitative terms the impact of those investments. And so whether that's engaging in sort of initiatives such as IRIS that Rockefeller have helped to spawn, or our own internal moves, so we now have IFC's development goals, and so all projects are measured against them. And at the moment, they're kind of reach numbers. So, you know, how many people are getting access to infrastructure services, to health, to education. But we're starting to capture those numbers, and we're starting to make investment choices and decisions based on them. But we're not yet at the other side of the equation, which says, okay, should I take a financial haircut to create social and environmental goals? And I suspect this might be a little bit of a conversation that we'll come back to. So I'll leave a thought. One of the challenges with impact investment is, one of the ways it's been defined is that there is an intent to try and drive social and environmental good. Impact investment needs to be really careful, because that's not good enough. It's not intent investment, it's impact investment. And if you're prepared to take a haircut, there is a foregone revenue. There is an effective subsidy. So not only do you have to be able to count the benefits, and the metrics such as IRIS are going to help to do that, you have to be able to do a cost-benefit analysis. You have to be able to demonstrate that you're creating impact. Now the hope is that you can leverage in more capital, you can create a bigger pot, you can use private sector efficiencies, and you will be able to show that. But without that cost-benefit equation, impact investment becomes intent investing. And that can be distortionary. And that actually works against the virtuous circle that I think Francis was talking about how the private sector can really generate impact.
You put two sort of open questions on the table. I'd like to get your thoughts on them, and then see if Mitchell and Open want to react as well. One is this dichotomy between financial first and impact first investors. And the open question in my mind is are these competing parties, or are they in fact reinforcing? In fact, is there a situation where an impact first investor in a deal makes it easier for the financial first folks to come in? And like I said, I want to put that out there as the open question. The other was your point about the fact that, you know, with these 80 people doing ESG work and whatnot, you've managed to achieve a pretty remarkable rate of return relative to what the private sector has achieved, you know, the other private sector entities have achieved, particularly in the last few years. And is there something about having an impact focus that reduces risk, increases sustainability, and over the long term is actually return enhancing? And is that the right dynamic to view this? That, yeah, I might be taking a haircut today because, I mean, I'll give you a big example. I'm not going to flip this business I invested in to take the short-term capital gain that's going to give me a really great IRR. I'm going to keep investing my profits to build for the long term, which will make my IRR look lower, but over the long term, I'll make more money. So those are two questions I would like to get your reaction to, and then see what Mitchell and Mildred, if they have thoughts.
So on the first, I may be in a kind of a universe of one, but I struggle a little with the notion of the continuum. I think that the interesting thing about impact investment is the two words. One is impact and one is investment. So as we think about that notion of impact, I've talked about that difference between intent and investment, intent and impact. But on the investment side, well, let's use the metrics of investment to create some bright lines. And I actually think you can put a bright line around an explicit haircut because you can do the economics ex ante. And if you do that, I think you then start to have conversations with different stakeholders. I think on the sort of the commercial side, if you're saying, look, I'm making good investments, I'm going to generate a return on capital that's commensurate with the risk of this capital. And by the way, I'm going to do X, Y, and Z. And I've thought about it differently. You're talking to mainstream public pension plans, you're talking to the $30 trillion that have signed up to the Principles for Responsible Investment. And you've got a particular dialogue and you've got a particular conversation. I think if you're on the other side, you're having a really interesting conversation with government about aid efficiency and aid effectiveness. And what you're saying is, you're saying, look, you have a whole range of interventions that you use to achieve public goods, and 158 billion and 80,000 doesn't seem particularly efficient. So let's look at whether this investment platform can create more bang for your taxpayer's dollar. And I actually think they're very, very different conversations. But your second point about, or the point about can you reinforce each other, yes, as long as you are explicit about the haircut so that you actually structure appropriately. And then I think it is absolutely the right way to move impact investing forward, is a sophisticated financial conversation with Wall Street, with the sort of the large investment banks, where you say, look, this is the amount of money I'm prepared to leave on the table. And boy, will they be able to work some financial wizardry if you can give them a free lunch. So how you reinforce that, I think it can reinforce, but you have to be clear that there are two distinct camps. With regards to IFC, I think the issue is more ex-ante risk perception. So I'll give a case in point. We do a lot of investment in private equity funds. And so, we've got a long and positive relationship with CF, where we see them as great intermediaries to intermediate capital more effectively and more efficiently than we can, sort of sitting in Washington, D.C. The traditional approach to investing in private equity funds is to wait until the fund has got 2 or 3 funds under its belt. They've got a track record. Oh, great! These guys know what they're doing. We'll invest with them. That becomes hard in a new market. Classic chicken and egg. So one of the things that IFC has done is said, okay, well, we think we understand the markets. We'll spend a bit longer. So it's the cost side rather than necessarily the haircut on returns. We'll spend a bit longer really looking CF in the eyes. What is their team doing? How is it comprised? Do they understand their markets? And then we'll make a bet with them, because we think that by doing that upfront homework, we can adjust the risk. And therefore, we can hopefully get a return. Our private equity portfolio, investing in funds, just private equity, over the last 10 years runs at about 23% IRR. Our return on first-time managers runs at 27%. We actually make more money because we're trying to understand the risk. So I don't think there's a haircut issue for us. I think it's more about making that investment and taking that risk, which we think actually works, because we've kind of we like to think we've understood it, whether we have or not, and just plain lucky, and we've picked great funds like CF. I believe for the evaluators.
Mitchell?
I really enjoyed your remarks. When we just had a couple of calls for proposals, and one was, I like to say it was the second set of social fund calls. We did a renewables call and an impact investing call, and we opened it up for first-time fund managers. And these were the sectors that are you often cited for impact: education, agriculture, healthcare, SME finance, water, sanitation. These are the microfinance, of course. These are the sectors that governments have primarily taken care of for many, many years in history. And someone said recently, and many of them aren't doing so well, are they, the governments? So one of the things that came to my mind as you were speaking is this dilemma where you have an entity such as Root Capital, which provides, it's an intermediary that provides financing for smallholder farmers. And for the ladies in the audience, we ladies look good out there in the field because they are primarily women. And there are so many farmers in need of just a little financing that you can grow businesses a lot of different ways, but the continuing balance between slowing down your growth and making it more profitable versus expanding your reach and providing sort of the entry-level services is one of the dilemmas. And then it comes to the fore when you go to talk to the investors, because you could say, oh, my lending model will become totally self-sustaining and I'll just, keep lending to these people, adding a few customers. Or the other way of approaching them is either to the investors and the grantors, or increasingly we have entities that realize that if they provide both buckets of funds, the grant money and the investment money, that we can perhaps reach more farmers or do more in climate change quicker through a collaborative approach. And I hate to say it over and over again, but one wonders how many SME expansion financing vehicles there need to be in the world with all of us and all the DFIs and everybody wanting to announce that new program to hit that missing middle niche that no one ever hit before, as opposed to trying to do it a little bit better. And one of the keys that we find, and it is kind of circular in nature, is that you can raise the capital, but you have to deploy the capital. You need to deploy the capital utilizing good managers of intermediaries and good vehicles to build the track record, to get more capital, to have more projects. And one of the things I just wanted to say in this forum in particular is we need good, solid young people coming along, working as interns or working in those jobs that aren't going to pay you all the money, or you can go learn about mainstream business and then sort of take a time in this field, because we talk about double bottom line or blended returns, and as a worker, as a person going through life, it's nice to make money, but you can never know what you learn and experience by helping others. So it's sort of a pitch to the youth that showed up here today to keep on the track, keep on the journey.
And I've heard the IFC line many times, and I have to say, IFC was not created to maximize financial return. OPIC was not created to maximize financial return, and that's my intellectual problem. I think what you have done is demonstrate that you can get above market financial returns in some very difficult places doing some very challenging things. So you've served that demonstration effect, and I think now you should allow the commercial sector to achieve those returns, and you need to move further down the scale and do more of what Mitchell is talking about in terms of, because this R&D is not going to happen in this space if everyone wants the 23% IRR. And so I think it's a legitimate debate. I think what you have achieved and the fact that you've done it by continuing to do the big things and doing some small things with organizations like ours is a beautiful demonstration effect of how you can blend all those things together. But I think it is going to be a challenge going forward, as Mitchell says, because we can't always do the hardest thing in the hardest place. I would fully agree with that, and we can't always take the lowest hanging fruit. And so that middle is still there. And we've got to find better ways to tackle it. And we know that some of what is required is to build capacity of companies, build capacity of the implementers who are going to be able to branch out and cover more space. And so I think the other piece of it is that you're right. There are some institutional benefits that World Bank, IFC, OPIC, any of the bilaterals have that your average investor won't have. So they're going to discount your return on equity a little bit when they look at what could I do as a purely private investor, because I won't have all those advantages. But the other thing is that you do have a lot of all of us are building on the back of a lot of good work that World Bank and IFC have done in R&D. And those returns, in fact, are built on that, or the fact that you've had some technical assistance providers on the grant side that have been able to come along and prepare the way or analyze the value chains in the agribusiness sector. So, all of us can build on that. It's fabulous work that's been done. But I do think, and I think increasingly the institution is recognizing that. You wouldn't have launched the SME Ventures program if people didn't believe that IFC needs to continue to play a role of looking at the challenging stuff at the same time that you continue to demonstrate that good returns are possible, because it's all about perception of risk and being willing to get in there very locally as you do with your fund managers and others.
Yeah, no, but I think just to sort of come back, the notion, particularly around the development of intermediaries, which goes to the sort of the enterprise fund model, and one uses private equity funds or venture capital funds or growth equity capital funds to intermediate capital into the marketplace, I think is a very valid one. I think that the ability to take risks that the commercial market won't take is a very valid role for development finance institutions to anchor new managers. I look at climate change at the moment, where you've got a nascent sector in emerging markets, you have a handful of managers. It's because of the role of OPIC, the role of the IFC and other intermediaries in backing those initial managers to get track record, which creates a wonderful virtuous circle, because the moment that you've got track record, then somebody copies you, and the Israeli government did it in the 1990s, essentially kickstarting their venture capital industry. $100 million of public capital to attract 8 funds. 10 years later, $9.6 billion industry. Using the natural power of the private sector. But that natural power of the private sector is driven by a profit motive. And so one has to be really clear about that, because the moment you start moving downstream, you've got to be really, really good at measuring distortion and making sure that what you're doing is impactful. And I don't disagree that it's a conversation that we should be having, but there is still a lack of definition about it, and a lack of ability to measure it, and a lack of ability to structure it.
Yeah. I think it would be helpful to have a discussion on what everyone thinks that it is. That I probed a little bit, but one more round about what the defined characteristics. But I also want to talk about, I want to posit that maybe the idea that the commercial sector is purely focused on financial return, maybe it's a little more complicated than that, because we work with a company that was created as purely a commercial company, was set to launch right before the financial crisis, and then of course with the financial crisis a lot of the investors pulled their money back. But it was a company that had a large social impact potential. And afterwards, a lot of those commercial investors said, we're really sorry this failed, because we really looked forward to being associated with this impact that you were going to create. And now the company has reconstituted itself as an impact investment and has gotten both development and commercial investors back in. And there is, again, that it doesn't all sit easily. They're all at the same table. There's a little bit of tension, but there is both sides like both aspects of it. And is there, when we think about where the next frontier is out there, is there a large market segment that is of investors that have been told from day one, you need to focus purely on IRR, you need to focus on financial return, that now are, thanks to perhaps the financial crisis, willing to take a more expansive view of what success is with an investment, recognizing at the end of the day, if you lose money, you don't have any more money to invest, and that's not a good thing. But that you can think about time horizons and different metrics besides simply that IRR measure. You're shaking your head, so I'll let you go with it.
Certainly, and I think we particularly know that if this space is able to break through to a purely retail market, and folks like, you know, Calvert Foundation with their community investment notes and others are beginning to do this. You know, most of us in our personal financial dealings are not out there to maximize financial return at the cost of everything else, because, you know, we realize that also puts us higher up on the risk curve, and most of us are more conservative than that, and we're prepared to do something that, you know, has a level of certainty to it, but we also like to feel good about what we're doing. And so, you know, I don't know if those are inconsistent, because some of what we're saying is, you know, risk can still be pretty high in some of these frontier places or these new structures and so on. On the other hand, you know, I think there is more generally an awareness of the fact that there is a real spectrum out there, and as you point out, the reality is most of us have not gotten 23%, you know, ROE on investments that we have made, and so our expectations are lower as well. So I think there is a place. I think, you know, the fact that you know, an integrated supply chain is critical for a corporation, and that there's a cost to not treating that supply chain or supporting it adequately that will come back potentially to bite, you know, down the road if you try to take every penny off the table in the early, you know, relationships with those supply chain vendors. So I think there's a little more balance seeking now, because we've seen that, you know, focusing solely on maximizing financial return has its own risks.
Well, I was going to look at from the institutional perspective. I think you bring up sort of two really interesting perspectives. A lot of times, sort of having conversations around this, and it doesn't really matter what the answer, or it doesn't really matter what the question is. The answer is pension funds. And so you've got this 20 trillion pool of assets that is purportedly long term. And there's two things with it. Number one is, if you actually look at the average holding periods of pension funds over the last, I think it's 10 years, and I may get these figures wrong, so but I think it's come down from something like an average of 3 years to 9 months. So, you know, 9 months may be long in the gestation process, but as a long-term investor. So we've got this interesting sort of issue in the sort of the commercial markets, where you're actually seeing longer-term investors not necessarily living up to that. The other goes to your point about IRRs. There is an understanding of fiduciary responsibility that says you maximize financial return. If you read, you know, pension law, what it says is you maximize in the interests of the beneficiary. And so there could be arguments around making sure that the world into which you inherit your pension is one in which you can breathe the air and drink the water. In fact, there might even be water for you to drink. So there is definitely a challenge around sort of definitions of fiduciary responsibility. And then that short-term, long-term absolutely plays out with companies, because the problem is, so the investor's thinking about 9 months, you know, what's a long-term? It's a long-term investment. It's a short-term trade that went wrong. But what are companies thinking about? The CEO of a company is absolutely worried where they're going to invest $300 million in the next factory, because, oh, hang on a sec, so adaptation, I'm looking that this factory might be around for 20 years. I need to be concerned about that. They're absolutely concerned about how you manage a labor force in a way that is productive and responsible. Mines are absolutely concerned about their social license to operate. And there is a little bit of a disconnect in that conversation between business and between sort of large commercial investors. So I think you're absolutely right that certainly on the institutional side, there are challenges. And it's a work in progress, and we've seen, certainly coming out of Europe, a lot of the large European pension funds sort of signing up to principles of responsible investment and trying to integrate. Some are going further than others. Some use it as PR. It's a process. It is a process.
Now, this has been a great conversation, but I think we need to open it up to these folks before we run out of time. So are there any questions? Yes? No?
Good, wonderful conversation or discussion. My name is Sarah, and I'm at the GW School of Business. The question that I have has to do with management support and technical assistance. You mentioned that you often rely on organizations that can provide grants. Now, when it comes to investments, I think a lot of what has to do with the risk a lot of it is the problem that occurs in deals has been that there aren't the right type of people that are running sort of businesses that one would want to invest in. And it seems that, for example, with IFC, you're investing in the 80 people to make sure that they're not investing in the wrong type of deals. And I'm curious as to what other recommendations you have apart from grants coming from grant-making organizations that would help support, help provide technical assistance to these businesses without relying on these traditional means.
Well, I guess, we've managed, I think, 28 funds over our 20-some year history, and, some of those have had technical assistance facilities that were grant funded, and some of them had no funding for technical assistance directly at all. And so when you have that situation, you work with what you've got, and so sometimes, and there are very good volunteer programs to get experts in, whether they're retired senior executives or other programs where there's a funding coming from another source to support these folks coming in, and then you get to the point where you work as much of it into the cost of your investment as you can, so that you factor that in. But all of us have limitations on size of investment and so on. So it is a big challenge. I think particularly the further down you go into the SME space, the more capacity building those companies need, the more hands-on support. So there is no substitute for getting a good local team that has some of the skill set to work with them on some of the basic, sort of horizontal things that every company needs, whether it's financial systems or HR policies or, financial controls, that sort of thing. But it's, and that's part of the reason I think that you need this sort of, as Mitchell always says, the layer cake approach, because some of those things don't pay the really short-term dividends, but they're critical for long-term success.
You? Mitchell?
I just want to say a bit about the layer cake.
Also,
It's
it's called a parfait.
I understand we have like 3 minutes, so it's a cake, it's a financing structure, and I hate raspberries, and raspberries the bottom layer, and that's the layer that if we have to lose, that's fine. I don't like raspberries anyway. Chocolate is the mezzanine layer. It's very interesting and complicated. And vanilla is for the namby-pamby senior debt lenders. They're really boring and they don't take much risk. And this cake sits on a plate, and next to it's a pitcher of chocolate sauce, which is the technical assistance, which you pour on top of the cake. It's kind of like icing, but it's kind of not like icing. And so it rolls over the side of the cake and over the plate and onto the table and onto the floor, and it's gone. So what we're all talking about is trying to take some of that chocolate sauce and maybe add a little less butter and water and make it more fudge-like and slip it in there under the raspberry layer, or you can have like side by side some chocolate cake, and that's taking some of that grant money that they used to pour on the floor and putting it underneath the cake, and then maybe you can have a bigger cake. And in response to Ewan, if the 80 people sort of helped enable a 23% return on investment over time, and you look at something like Bridge Academies, it's a school-in-a-box curriculum product that's changing schools in Nairobi, Kenya, and the environs. But this school-in-the-box product, which started out with 2 and Amidiar invested in it, and we're hoping that it's getting near the point where we can start to look at it. So it was set up as an early stage social investment by a granting entity, Amidiar. If they're going to have lots of these boxes around and like put a box all over Africa, it's still not going to be a $10,000 Rolex watch type of item, because it's for kids to go to school, and we need kids to go to school. So what we need to do is maybe, I like your idea about quantifying it, show that when you use a technique like E&Co, it's energy saving investments, where when you raise the money for that investor, you go and you say, of your dollars, we'd like to use 30 cents of your dollars for technical assistance and grant or buying down the cost. And we think you're going to do better on that 70% or 70 cents a got invested by virtue of the fact that we brought in that information systems person, or hey, a human resource person, so you could have like, you know, good human, you know, resource policies for your employees, which I said earlier was your most important asset to begin with.
So very quickly, I love the layer cake. I think I might have to use it.
Especially before lunch.
Especially before lunch, but talking about fudge. Because I think you're absolutely right. I think Ianco's a wonderful example, and we know Ianco very well. But and I hate to talk about equity in OPIC. But in many cases, what we're looking at is we're looking at that kind of transformative capital, which is going to enable businesses to grow, which, you know, is going to be equity-like, if not equity. And we've talked about enterprise funds, we've talked about private equity funds, which are wonderful intermediaries to move capital. And one of the things that we've been trying to think about, and this is a shameless plug for a piece of work that we're going to release in the next week, but with regard to climate change, is how do you make the chocolate sauce fudge? And one of the ways that you do it is you build it into the structure of the industry. And so you can, rather than providing capital in a standalone jar, you can put it in the format that private equity funds use. So they have capital that they draw to make investments, and they have capital they draw to pay their operating costs. So we'll put a concessional form of capital up there that they can draw for the incremental costs, the costs that accrue to the small transaction size, the costs that accrue to understanding the regulatory environment in country X with regards to grid-connected solar, the costs that essentially stop them looking at a deal. Now, the deal may or may not make sense, but they're not even looking at deals because, you know what, it eats into my management expense, I can't.
Exactly.
But what we will do is it's not chocolate sauce. In the event that this fund is successful, it gets repaid. So public capital is essentially taking equity risk, because if the fund isn't successful, they're not going to get their money back. But if the fund is successful, all of the money gets repaid, maybe with a debt-like return. But at least what you're then doing is you're trying to increase the value and the efficiency of the taxpayer dollar, but you're structuring it in a way that works for the private sector. You're not adding additional transaction costs of one of the 80,000 projects. You're saying, this is how your industry works. There's where the money is. Your choice, your risk. If it works, you pay us back before you go and buy your shiny new toy or whatever it is. So that's one of that's sort of, I think, some of the ways that we can think about the structuring issue that John brought up, and trying to get more fudge in the world.
And I think and you're going to end up with some more sort of widely applicable good things that come out of that. So the public goods concept as well. And clearly all of these things that are at that cutting edge, that leading edge, the innovative stuff is going to leave behind some public goods. And so it makes sense that some of these institutions will help support that.
Well, this could go on for quite a while, as you all know. Unfortunately, I think we're over time, but hopefully you all are sticking around for lunch so people can ask specific questions to you afterwards. I do want to emphasize some of the themes that people brought up. The idea that collaboration is fundamental to what we're talking about with regard to impact investing. We never really drilled down to what the it is, so that conversation can go on. But there is this tension between the financial first and the impact first, and ideally you want to turn that into something that's mutually reinforcing as opposed to competitive, and that there is value that's created through this process that, just as we were talking about with regard to developing new markets, developing new knowledge that then has an investment return of its own. I would like each panelist, if they could just end with a quick snippet of what they would like to see most in the future with regard to this sector to really help reach the scale and move the needle the way I think we all want to do. We'll start with on my far right with Ewan, and then on this bit.
Okay, I'm going to go right out of left field, and I'm going to come back to the retail conversation and the notion of if we can get to definition, so we've accepted what it is, a gold standard for it that enables individuals to make contributions that are tax deductible. Works in this country. May not work in others, but I think certainly where you have large sort of charitable givings is sort of part of the way that sort of people work. but you need to make the gold standard. I think the sort of having kind of tierings of A, B, C, and D is difficult, but a gold standard, accounted, these guys are up, these guys are not. If you're up, tax deductible investment, and that will help to stimulate the retail base. It's a little bit out of left field.
So in other words, as opposed to a contribution, a tax deductible investment.
Yeah, so it's a right. So then you can make a choice between charity X or investment fund Y, and you do so on the basis of expected benefits and the same principles as that apply.
Very provocative. Mitchell, can you beat that?
I'd like, this is what the world would like, right?
This is what-
It's nothing to do with OPIC.
Yes.
I'd like a not-for-profit bigger than governments to run an entity which oversees a database driven by a map of the world with pre-screened projects to enable large, medium, small retail, Calvert-style, Kiva-style investment to reach projects. That's what I'd like.
Mildred?
I like the idea of the tax deductible investment. I think
With that, of course.
that's good. I think what's missing are realistic ways to achieve the scale that is going to be the vehicle through which this investment comes. I mean, I think what's happening now is that the whole space has made huge strides in building infrastructure, whether it's the rating systems, the metrics, getting the sort of name for what we're all doing understood in the common language. And at the same time, all that infrastructure is built. We've got some beautiful bridges and highways now, and we don't have enough traffic on them. And we've got to figure that out. Some of it will come from the one-off, one country, small opportunity, but we need to begin to create sort of the larger scale, vehicles into which this investment can go, and through which we can actually begin to see some significant impact.
Excellent.
And John,
Yes.
what would you like?
Yes,
Yeah.
you have a view. and you
I
should.
thought I was going to get off scot-free. My own feeling, and you may have heard it throughout this, is that I think there's an element of what we're doing which is really about returning to fundamentals of investing. We spent a lot of time in the last 5 years looking at pieces of paper and ascribing value to them that were really, made-up values. And I think part of what I'd like to see, which I think would bring a lot more capital into this in a good way, and I take your point, Mildred, that with the capital has to come projects, so we have to work on that piece too, or investments, not projects, enterprises, opportunities. But it's for people to look at opportunities in a way that says, what is the intrinsic value that's being created, not what is this little number here in the corner that says IRR of 30 or 25 or 60%, because what we found out is that number tells a very little part of the whole story. And I think good, sound investing has to look at the whole story. I think this was an excellent discussion. Thank you all. Now we get to get our